Yes, there we go. Okay, so animal production. We are disconnected. We already talked about that. We need to be sustainable about it. We need to do it in the modern world, but we just don't understand where these products come from. Like we talked about that steak. We just don't really understand what's involved behind that. And that's what this is about. And then there's lots of pressure on the farmer to do it properly. Okay, so we're separated from animals and animal products. That leads to these debates. What I was just getting ready to say is sometimes I feel, and I'm an advocate of livestock production, but sometimes I feel that it's a little bit biased, and that's where I'd bring up groups like PETA. And the internet can allow people to publish things that are a little bit skewed at times. And so just be aware of that, and you'll be able to, on our field trip, you'll get to see a dairy farm, and you can make your own conclusions as to whether you like what you see or you don't, and what changes could be made. Okay, family farm is really important, especially in livestock. This is the area where families and small producers are still very much involved, right? We'll be visiting the DeFries family that runs Hinkley Dairy. So now I'm on the fourth slide. It's a picture of some cows eating out of a feed bin at a confined feeding operation. They're all together. Their food is brought to them. That's what we know as a confined feeding operation, rather than letting the animals go out on the range or out on pasture to get their food, right? And we just mention again that in California, this is big business. This is agribusiness. This is that industrial scale farming that we're talking about, right? And we've already talked about that there's some issues with this. One of them being the waste. How do we treat when the waste's all concentrated in one place, the manure and the urine, and maybe even some pesticides or something? How do we make sure that waste doesn't contaminate, pollute things like our groundwater? Okay, we also want to start supporting, and this whole movement to be more sustainable in live production is sort of started this new word, a locavore, someone who eats locally. He likes to know where their beef goes from. So we won't be visiting this semester, but we will next semester. We will be visiting Earl Graham. You hopefully watched his video up from his ranch in Summit Valley. Well, he produces his own brand of beef. It's called natural beef. And it's marketed locally in the sense that it's marketed to San Diego. And people pay a lot more money for that, but they know what they're getting, and people are starting to be aware of it. And again, it's that thing about the consumer. You guys, us, we're all the consumer, and we ultimately have the power to say, no, we don't like that practice. We would like to see you do it this way, and we'll take our money where our mouth is, as so to say. Okay? Consumer power, and it comes back to this word, what kind of animal husbandry do we do, right? I'm a husband and a father and all of that, and I'm supposed to take care of the people that are under me. Well, that's what animal husbandry is. How do we do this properly and responsibly? Okay, just quick look, milk and cream are our top product in California in terms of dollar value. So dairy is huge in California. It's actually the biggest in the country. Cattle and calves. Now, when we talk cattle and calves for you non-agricultural people, by the way, how many of you have had some interaction with cattle, for example? How many of you have been on a farm or have cattle right now? Just show of hands real quick. All right, cool. All right, what is that in terms of FFA, or does your family, just one example of your interaction with cattle? Can I get one example from you guys? Somebody want to talk about the experience?
Just on it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Okay. I was in the Alps a while back, and then they have cows up there that they just allow to graze in the mountains, and then they send them down into lowlands.
Yeah.
During, I believe, the fall.
Yes.
Where they eat all of the grass they've been trimming.
Yes.
So it was pretty cool because it was like a total contrast to what I was used to in terms of confined feeding operations that you see around California. So
Awesome.
it was just
Awesome.
it was an interesting contrast.
Right. So they're grazing out on what we would call the range, out on natural environment, and they move around based on where the food is, right? We actually do the same thing. We do kind of the opposite. We bring them down out of the mountains, even here locally, where we have a grazing concession, the Rock Springs grazing concession. They're up there in the spring because that's when it's wet, that's when there's green grass, and then they come back down lower to pastures or other feed like hay, supplemental feed, and we're going to talk about that when it's the summertime because that's our dry period. In Switzerland, if that's, you said, was that Switzerland, the Alps in general, right? They go down because it's lower down in that they have the grass in the summer. So it's just a different climate and that, but basically the animals are following the food. We're not bringing the food to the animals as you would in a confined feeding operation. Thank you. That was Enrique, right? Did I say it wrong again?
Yeah, that was
Okay.
Enrique.
Enrique, okay. All right. Chickens, way up there. Bees. So we're also going to talk about bees. Bees are a huge part of the agricultural landscape for lots of different reasons. The biggest one is that they're an essential pollinator. So many of our crops need to be pollinated. And because agriculture has become so industrialized, we have taken away a lot of the native habitat for the native pollinators, specifically the native bees. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. So we have to actually bring in European bees. So you guys know that your average bee that you see, not your yellow jacket, which is a native bee, or not some of the little bumblebees or the black bees we see around here in the Mojave, but your European bee is actually an imported species, right? We've brought those in. They're not native. They're not local, okay? And they're needed for avocados, plums, strawberries, walnuts, almonds, which is a huge crop. We have to bring, and they literally are brought in from other states. Most of these bee producers, people that have the bees, lost their name. Does anybody remember the name for a bee person?
Beekeeper.
Yeah, well, beekeeper, but there's another fancy one. Aparian, a what? A-P-A-R-I-N. Anybody got it? Okay, anyway, they come from places like Wyoming, and they come down in big trucks with thousands of beehives, and they move them around the agriculture, like in the San Joaquin Valley over in Bakersfield. Okay, they're European or Western bees, and then of course there's always this question about Africanized. And that was a big concern a few years ago where the Africanized bee was coming up from Brazil, actually, and breeding with our local bees and making them more aggressive. And we do have some Africanized colonies locally, but they've mostly been able to contain those. Unfortunately, what they've done with those, if they find an Africanized colony, a very aggressive colony, a native bee colony, they actually just exterminate all of them because they needed to get those genes out of the system because bees are such an essential part of our world. Okay, there they are, cutest thing that you guys all know, the incredible social structure they have, and they have their specific jobs, and of course they also produce some other things. We actually have quite a big play in bees locally. This is a picture I took last winter up in the Marianas, and this was just a small part of some hives that were overwintering with us. I don't know who owned them, but they just showed up out there on Bureau of Land Management land, part where I ride my mountain bike, and there were probably 300-400 hives overwintering there, a place where the bees can just kind of hang out. During the winter, they don't actually hibernate, but they become very passive and don't use up a lot of energy and don't need much. Okay, bees, real quick, the native bees, they're essential pollinators, but like I say, we've done, especially in big agricultural areas, we've taken away their native habitat, so we've reduced their numbers. There's a big push to bring that back. So the new thing is what's called native hedgerows, and we have a student who works on that over in the local U.S. Department of Agricultural an ex-student at USDA office on what a native hedgerow is. So around the fields, instead of having barren land, now they'll actually plant native plants, okay? And that's what's called a hedgerow. And one of the main purposes of that is to get these beneficial insects back, especially bees, so that they can be the natural pollinator and we don't have to import, as it were, the European bees to do the pollinating, okay? Local vegetation is cleared, herbicide use, all these things have affected the native pollinators, the native bees, okay? Of course, they do have some products. Beeswax and honey are very important products. But even with that, the U.S. and all the agriculture, we still import about half of our honey from overseas. Okay, bees are under severe pressure from a thing called colony collapse disorder, right? And what they're doing, what they suddenly started noticing, you guys, is the bees just died in a whole colony at a time. They had a colony and then boom, they're all dead. In fact, they weren't even dying on site. They just weren't even coming back. They'd just go off and the whole colony would just disintegrate. And they think that was mostly due to the varroa mite. Mite is a tiny little bug that infects them, and actually it's a parasite, draws on their body fluids. And that was the biggest reason, but they're also concerned about cell phone transmissions, all kinds of theories as to why. And of course, pesticides and herbicides. Some of them, especially the new group that are called the nicotinoids, the nicotine-like pesticides are a big concern for bees. Okay, honey is worth 3.1 billion. Pollination fees, see, that's the biggest number out there, 224 million. That's when we pay these folks to bring their bees onto my almond farm at that critical period when the flower's out and I need them to be pollinated. Packaged bees sold to beekeepers. Queen bees, people breed queen bees and then ship them actually all over the world. My brother is a beekeeper in New Zealand as his hobby. He's retired now, but that's his hobby. And he was telling me when he was here that he'll buy his queens from local queen breeders, as it were. Okay. Now, quickly, cattle and calves, the beef side. Okay. So we're going to talk about dairy, but when you hear the word cattle and calves, that means we're talking about cattle for beef. Okay. And we'll see they're actually a different kind of breed. They look differently. We'll see some. If you guys aren't familiar with that, you'll see. You'll see what they look like in a moment, okay? There's lots of cattle grazing going on in California. Most of the cattle production is out on the range, so that's really cool. And we'll get to understand why that's really cool in a moment, because they're eating food that we don't eat or couldn't use. Very important, keeping families on the land again. A lot of the cattle ranches, the more cowboy types, those are little family ranches, little family farms. In fact, we will in the spring we will get to visit the Blair Ranch, which is a small little ranch right in the middle of the Mojave National Preserve. But then he has the rights to graze on 700,000. You guys have any feeling for how big 700,000 acres of land is, right? He's got his own little country out there that he grazes his cattle on, right out here on the way to Needles. And we'll actually get to visit them and talk to them. And they graze on the Mojave Desert, 1 cow per 1,000 acres. Okay, so they're not overgrazing, they're not damaging the land, and it's working really, really well. But they're a small family operation. The Grahams, Earl Graham, that you hopefully saw the video on in the last few days, from upstream at the Summit Valley, and then his brother Lee, who farms right across from the Lewis Center, the AAE. He farms all that land, and then they graze cattle on that land there, the Kemper Campbell Ranch. Okay, so what do we do when we do this? Well, this gets a bit technical, and this is probably stuff you won't get tested on specifically. We have 2 breeds of cattle that are used for beef. There's the European beef, beef, which is Bos Taurus, and there's the other ones, the Zebu line, big rangy cattle with humps on their backs called Bos Indicus. And so a European breed would be an Angus or be an Hereford, right? And we know there's this big push, which is kind of a silly marketing thing actually, because the beef doesn't taste any different. Well, this is an Angus burger as opposed to a something else burger. Well, that's actually kind of nonsense, because Angus meat depends on how it's raised and what it's eaten. Doesn't taste any different from one made from a Brahman cow, okay, or cattle. Okay, so big issue in the past was poor range management, overstocking, allowing the cattle to go and destroy the stream beds and the streams and pollute things. That's gone away. Now there's extremely strong regulations about how many cattle can be grazed per acre. In the Mojave, like I said, it's anywhere for one mother cow and a calf up to 1,000 acres. And even the highest grazing rates are about 100 acres. So they're very limited grazing, limited time of year, so they don't interfere with the desert tortoise, for example. There they are. Now I'm getting, this is the kind of stuff that I get excited about. We are now at the picture where there's 4 cattle in the middle of it. There's a big red one on the left. Do you guys see that? So I think Tim's doing something over there. But there's a red one, then there's some white ones down below. Those are the Bos Indicus. Then there's a black Angus to the right, and then there's a mixed breed to the bottom of that. Okay. So next slide is a picture of some Mojave yucca and some red grass. That red grass is brome, and the reason you're seeing that is that's actually an invasive species of grass. That's a Mediterranean grass. That's the thing that gives you the stickers, and it's okay food for cattle, but it normally comes in after either overgrazing or too much fire. And we've been having huge fire problems across the rangeland, all across California for quite a while now. Okay, then there's a picture of a rancher, a cowboy, and his dog herding some Hereford cattle. Those are the white-faced cattle that were very traditional to the American West. They're actually a European beef breed originally. Okay, calves and beef, the big thing is range management. So it's when we graze and how intensively we graze. And there's a lot of work on that. And did you guys get to watch the Alan Savory TED Talk? You guys get to watch that? Pretty impressive, right? So that's the kind of science that's now behind grazing management. He came up with this idea is we actually need to graze grasses very intensively, but then back off so they got time to recover. So they don't have that thatching effect where they basically kill themselves by shading themselves out with extra biomass, extra growth. Okay, so what's going on with beef? Why would somebody be myself advocating beef? Because everybody's saying, oh yeah, what we need to do to solve the world's problems is stop eating meat and just go to eating vegetables and eating down the food chain. Well, that's true, because each time we go from one feeding level to the next, one trophic level to the next, we lose approximately 90% of the nutrient value from that feed. So if we ate the corn, then we're going to get about 90% more value out of it than if we feed it to cattle and then eat the cattle. Okay? But we have that I guess is really a privilege. We are able to buy meat and eat meat and dairy products, and it's very cultural. I don't think we're going to persuade the United States and especially the West that, hey, steaks are out, steaks are bad. So how do we do that sustainably? Okay? And one of the things we need to understand is we're not actually directly competing with humans for food. Some of the time we are. In a confined feeding operation, when we go to the dairy, you'll see they do feed them some corn. Well, corn is a staple for many, many cultures, right? One of those would be the Spanish culture, right, with the tortillas and everything. So a few years ago, when the price of corn went through the roof, doubled, there were actually protests in Mexico against that. And so it's very bad, in my opinion, at that point to be feeding that to cattle. Or even worse, what we're doing right now is taking that corn and using it for biofuels, using it for biodiesel, using it for ethanol. Because actually we'll find out later in the class, or next year at least, that ethanol actually isn't very efficient when it's made from corn. It actually has a negative energy value. It takes more energy to produce it than you actually get out of it. And so that's not appropriate. That, to me, that's not sustainable. Okay? But cattle have these big fermentation chambers. There's 4 of them. They're called the rumen. And basically, there's a bunch of bacteria in there that are fermenting, almost like the way you make, you ferment for beer or ferment for brandy. You've got a bunch of bacteria just eating up all these nutrients, and it's stuff that we can't eat, right? So grass, basic grasses, we eat the grain, but we don't eat the grass stems. Those are woody. Those we use as fiber. They help keep enough fiber in our diet, but we don't actually digest them down into the starches and into the glucose, basically, that it's made up of. Well, a ruminant can do that. So what are ruminants? Let's get who of you there could, other than cattle, what are the other ruminants that we have as livestock? What's another 1 or 2 ruminant livestock?
Sheep.
Enrique, you seem to be the expert right now. Think of other livestock. What are we talking about? We're talking about chickens. Are they a ruminant? Nah, they're not really. They're partially ruminant. Goats. Did you say goats?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Goats.
Right answer. Goats are a ruminant. Goats are also cool because right in this slide, this is a slide that has preferred grass on the right side of it. That's not marijuana. That's actual grass, right? Beef cattle prefer grass. Goats actually prefer browsing. They prefer shrubs. So they're good at keeping that kind of biomass down and utilizing that. Sheep. So the main ones are beef, sheep, and goats. Those are our main ruminants. Chickens and pigs. Pigs are actually, we think of pigs as they can eat anything. Actually, not true. They are actually like us. They're actually a simple stomach with an acidic stomach. And the only place we can digest some of this is back in the colon. Same way with a pig. Horses are a mixture. And if Tim's over there, he'll nod his head. And horses are a mess because they're a mixture of a lot of things, and that causes them a lot of problems. Their basic health issue in horses is a thing called colic. And that relates back to the fact that they've got a mixed up stomach in the first place. Here's a picture of a cow eating grass. We can eat grass, and fresh green grass, we'll get some nutrients out of it. Won't feel so good afterwards, probably. But dry grass, we won't get any nutrients out of it all. Whereas a cow or a pig or a goat or a sheep will. Okay.
Professor Slade, I have
Yes.
a question about ethanol.
Yes.
So that creating ethanol from corn is, I think you said negative energy.
Yeah, it's called the
Something along those
net.
lines?
We have a calculation that's called the net energy. Yes, it has a negative net energy. But continue with your question.
Okay. So even if it is a negative net energy, is it more efficient, or not more efficient, but better than drawing out fossil fuels like from the ground the way that we do normally?
Yeah, so it's a valid question. I mean, should we be looking for what we would call a biofuel? Yes, we should. But let's look for a biofuel that has a positive net energy. So there's a new grass that they can grow, very fast growing grass called switchgrass. And we could produce that, or we could grow algae, and we could have a very high positive net energy. So I would say no, it's a wash, because fossil fuels, they cause the same pollution problems that biofuel costs in the case of ethanol from corn. And if it's a net negative energy, we're actually taking more energy to use it. So basically, if you think about it, how did we harvest that corn? Right? We used technology, we used big tractors and harvesters. So we actually, not only did we get that energy out, we actually spent more energy in terms of fossil fuels getting it than it's worth. Does that make sense? It's kind of a
Yes,
balancing thing. So biofuels are good, but again, biofuels are only good depending on whether they're appropriately applied. In sustainability, we have a principle called appropriate technology. So biofuel technology is good, but when it's not appropriately applied, like in the case of using corn, then it's not. It's not green, it's not sustainable. It's a lot of hype that's been sold to the public, and some of our congressmen own farms in the Corn Belt, and they get subsidies to grow their corn, and it's all kind of a vicious circle that I think in time will go away. But the concept's good. Let's promote. Let's try to get biofuels. But corn's the wrong kind of biofuel, mostly because it's a human food in the first place. Not only is it a net negative energy, but it's a human food. So what are we doing when people are starving, using that to make an energy source that actually is really not worth its salt, right? Does that make sense, Enrique? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
All right, no problem. All right, so beef, another thing. We're going to go dairy cows in a moment, so ignore the first one. This is still, in the bottom of the slide, it says methane. So methane is same kind. It's a hydrocarbon like propane. We can run motors with this. At the Victor Valley Waste Reclamation Authority, they run all their motors now to run that plant for the wastewater treatment, the sewage plant, using methane. They take the waste, basically our feces, what's left over at the hard part of it, and they biodigest it. It's like a big rumen that digests it and it gives off methane. Well, same thing happens in a ruminant inside a cow. They give off a bunch of methane, as do we, by the way. Part of what we flatulate is methane. And methane is bad. Methane is up to 25 times, not percent, 25 times worse as a greenhouse warming gas than carbon dioxide. So there's a valid point towards this. What are we going to do here? Because cows are one of the sources of methane. Ruminants are one of the sources. But then again, it's balanced of what are we going to eat, and can we really make sure that at least those animals are eating food that humans aren't going to consume. Okay? But you'll hear that conversation already, that basically, to be gross about it, cow farts are a big problem, right? I think it's a bit over-dramatized personally, but anyway. Okay, dairy, milk and cream is the largest commodity in California agriculture. It's bigger than Wisconsin. Most people would think offhand, oh, it's Wisconsin, that's the leading dairy state. No, actually, they have more dairies, but we have much bigger dairy farms. We have over 1,000 cows on most dairies. The one we are visiting is over 2,000 cows. Wisconsin's are much smaller, and they also have some pasture grazing. Some of their dairies, the cattle go out to the pasture. They're not necessarily all confined feeding operations. Okay, confined feeding operations are the big deal in dairy. There's all kinds of dairies. There's the ones right on the urban fringe. I've recently been making a few visits down to the ones in Chino. And their issue there is they're selling the land for a lot of money that those dairies are on to development, to human development. So somebody comes in, builds houses, condominiums right next to the dairy. When they come in, they're told, hey guys, listen, you're moving next to dairies. You're actually moving in Chino into a dairy preserve. That's an agricultural preserve. And you need to be ready. There are going to be some flies. There's going to be some stink. But very soon, after they've been there a little while, all of a sudden there's protests and all this stuff that says, oh, we don't want the dairies. So the dairies are being forced out of those areas. Then we have ones that are way out in a rural environment, like the one we'll visit in Hinkley. So just know that these dairies are in very very diverse places. Sometimes, like in Chino, they're right now right in the middle of the city, actually. So breeding. This is what I've got my degree in, and is mostly in animal breeding. And we can do tremendous things. We're not talking about genetic modification right now, GMO. We're just talking about breeding the best of the best. Okay? This is specialized, hybridized breeding, where we just take the best animals and breed to the other. It's all crossbreed when we want a certain traits. And that's what you'll see there. I'm just going to point, I'm going to go to the next slide. On the left, if you guys are on the right slide now, there's 3 pictures of a bunch of cows. There's black and whites on the left, there's red and whites on the right, and then there's some cream-colored one, jerseys, and all their heads are facing. You guys on that slide okay? Got it? Okay. So what's going on here is the traditional dairy cow is on the left. It's called a Holstein, okay? Also called a Friesian. And they're very big. They have very, very, very high production, but they also have issues with their legs, specifically the hind legs, their hocks can break down very quickly, because just like big people have problems with their knees, these cattle have problems with their hocks or their knees, right? And so they don't stay in production very long because they actually start to get arthritic and have problems moving around. So they maybe only stay in production about 3 or 4 years. Whereas if I crossbreed them with jerseys that are about half their size, I get, or with the one on the right, which is a French breed, a Montbéliarde, I get a much more hardy cow. They're more athletic, they last longer. I can keep them in production 7, 8 years, which means 7 or 8 cycles, okay? Because what you do, right, with a dairy cow is you're trying to get them in milk. So you breed them, they have a calf, and then they stay in milk for about 10 months after that. Then they have another calf, and then you keep going. They have a short dry period of about 2 to 3 months, while at the very end of their gestation, before they give birth to the next cow. They don't just automatically produce milk all the time. They have to be bred and have calves, right? And so, so this crossbreeding has helped. The jerseys also do a lot for quality. So in milk, we don't just need the milk, we also need the byproducts like cheese and butter, which is the butterfat content. And Jersey has a very high butterfat content. So in New Zealand now, most of the herds are crossed between those top 2. The Holstein on the left and the cream-colored one, the Jersey, up on the top right. Those are the 2 breeds that are crossed together. Okay, Hinkley Dairy is the next slide. There's 2 pictures there. You see the cattle looking through the stanchions on the left, and their food has been piled up outside. It's mostly hay, mostly alfalfa hay. Hay is just grass that's been cut and dried and brought to them. And on the right is the actual milking parlor. Cows go in there twice a day. They get hooked up to these suction pumps, and they actually milk them right in those, what's called a dairy parlor there. And you guys will get to see that. So that'll actually be quite fun. There's Kenny DeFries himself standing there right next to the cow. If you look on the next slide, you look on the left-hand side, you can actually see the suction cups on the cow's udder. Doesn't hurt the cow at all. Looks uncomfortable, but it isn't. And then on the right, he's actually demonstrating some feedstuffs. So even in dairy, we could say, okay, well, you know, I don't like this confined feeding operation because they're eating mostly human food, high quality food. Well, no, they still eat a lot of byproducts from agriculture that we wouldn't eat. So what he's actually holding there in his hand on the right is actually almond seed hulls. So the almond, we've taken the almonds out and we've got the hulls. That's a very high quality food that ruminants can actually digest. So they have cottonseed hulls. They have brewer's grain, which is the leftover grains after they've produced brandy or whiskey or whatever it was. And they feed all of these things together in, if you go back to the slide before, you see that big line of food lying there. Well, there's grains and these byproducts actually in there for the cows to eat. Okay, so next one is we're looking at the waste management. That's a big pile of horse dung, I'm not horse dung there, but cow dung. And it's a special separator device, and then they take the urine and they put it out on the fields. And long story short, by handling it properly and putting it out on the right level back out onto alfalfa that's then cut and refed to the cows, they can actually take all those nitrates out of supply, because nitrates are the basic building blocks for proteins, and there's a lot of protein in a crop like alfalfa, and then that alfalfa hay goes right back to the cows. And so they can actually prevent the nitrates, if it's properly managed, from actually getting into the water at all. And nitrates in the water, as we all know, is a neurological issue, blue baby disease, and we don't want that water from that dairy getting contaminated right there and then going on down to Barstow. But this dairy actually, because of the way they manage their wastes, actually are improving the nitrates, not hurting them. Okay. The other thing is are these giant dairies inhumane? Yeah, I think it's a valid point if you look at them, but I think if you really look at the cows themselves, they're quite happy. They're very happy. They don't mind having their food brought to them. Okay. It actually takes a lot of work, and it's quite painful for some of them when they're in heavy milk to go traipsing out through the mud to get out to the pastures. Okay. So just because they're in a confined feeding operation, as long as they're properly taken care of, I would actually make a case that cow by cow, they might actually be happier cows, just like on the TV ads, right? So there are a few right at the bottom there. Not all California dairies are huge. Some of them are a little smaller. Real quick, there are organic standards for producing beef, which would mean that the hay and all of that that's fed to them would be produced organically. The alfalfa would be grown organically, which would mean no synthetic fertilizers, would be natural fertilizers, for example. Then there's this whole push as well towards raw milk, which means the milk has not been pasteurized, heated up to somewhere in the middle hundreds, if I remember right, to kill any bacteria that might be in the milk. Very dangerous, in my opinion, because there's a really, really bad disease that a friend of mine had in South Africa called brucellosis, that it can be in dairy cows. And so I don't see the point of not drinking pasteurized milk personally. As a past, we had a small dairy on our farm in South Africa, so I don't quite get the cheese. Talks about cheese as being very important. It's also a pretty big part of the agricultural production in California. There's very strict sanitary standards, and 47% of our milk supply in California goes towards cheese, right? It's kind of cool because cheese is a really good way to preserve milk, right? Milk, obviously, if you don't keep it refrigerated, it's going to go off. Make cheese out of it, now it's much easier to store and to transport to places even that need food aid. Often it's not milk that goes, but it's cheese and yogurt and that kind of stuff that gets exported, okay? Increases the value. Chickens, ranked number 12 in the U.S. California's share of the U.S. is only 3%, but we have quite a few chickens. Did you guys, anybody noticed any chickens around here? You guys? No? Anybody drive down Deep Creek Road? Yeah? As you get down there to that road, I think it's called Jess Ranch Road, or no, what would that be called? That would be called, I know exactly what that's called. Oh, I used to live close to there. But the little road that goes down to Jess Ranch, if you're coming from Bear Valley Road, it goes off to the right. There's a chicken ranch right off to your left, right? Those are pullets. Those are for meat. Those are meat chickens. Those are not for eggs. But in Lucerne Valley, there's still a lot of chickens. So we do have some chicken operations locally. Okay. Again, there's probably just some basic information. I don't think we have to go into in great detail. There's definitely some disease issues in chickens. Newcastle disease is a huge issue. Will kill off a whole flock of chickens, a whole farm full of chickens very easily. Big one at the bottom of the next slide, that's the slide now that you should be looking at. It has Newcastle disease in yellow in the middle of it, as Proposition 2. Okay, so real quick on Proposition 2, I'm going to say 5 years ago, it was a proposition on our local California ballots, right? And we California voted to approve it. And livestock people think it was a little bit of a scam, a little bit of over dramatization. But one of the issues that was highly publicized is chickens that are for eggs are kept in cages. The cages are above ground. The chicken's in the cage and the egg rolls out to the outside and they can be easily collected. Chickens in cages, we did that myself in South Africa. I don't think the chicken knows the difference. We don't want to make it, I can't even say that word, but make it like put our human emotions on top of a chicken, right? Anthropomorphize. So we don't want to do that, but they had started to put many, many chickens in one cage. A cage that was made for 2 chickens might have 8 chickens. So they banned that with Proposition 2. And so now they have to have a different caging system. And that was okay. The only problem for the consumer was that the moment that came in, the price of eggs went up substantially because it was cost a lot more to produce those eggs. Okay, but that's Proposition 2. Also was used for pigs, for pig farrowing crates, a crate that prevents the mama pig from squashing the pigs. It looks awful because the mama for the first few weeks is in this tight little crate and the piglets are outside, but it prevents her from squashing half of them. So again, as livestock producers, we're like, what? Doesn't make any sense. Okay, so there's your chickens in the cages. Way too many of them, obviously not a good thing. So now they have to have enough room in the cage where they can actually spread their wings and turn around and be happy. Okay, so you guys are done. Good. So you've got this presentation. I'm going to finish it, and then I will see you guys tomorrow if that's okay, Mrs. Pike.
Yes, that'd be great.
Perfect. Thank you. So eggs and chickens. Eggs. U.S. ranked number 5th, so we're the 5th largest egg producing state in the country. There's a picture of that's actually a pullet production facility. So again, they've restricted now their overcrowding for those kinds of situations. Goats ranked number 2 in the United States, and the California share is 5%. So let me just turn this down. There we go. Okay, so we can keep going here. But yeah, so goats are important. Obviously, we already talked about they're a forager, they're a browser. They eat bushes, and that's important, especially in fire control. If you just leave most of our local plant communities, the shrubs will just get thicker and thicker and thicker, and eventually it'll convert to just shrubland instead of shrubland and grassland. And so they're supposed to be grazed. And our top herbivore, which would have probably been deer or goats, bighorn sheep, would have taken care of that. But we don't have that anymore. So it's important to maintain these grazing animals on the land. That's the case for cattle grazing, for goat grazing, for sheep grazing. With the provisor is we do it properly. We don't overgraze. We don't actually destroy those habitats by overgrazing and killing those plants, killing the grasses. So goats, you can, other point about goats is you can have meat goats. And then you can have meat and dairy goats, which produce milk and meat. Those are called dual purpose. Or you could just have milk goats. So there's my favorite. I actually breed these. These are the South African breed called Boer goats. They're mostly for meat, but they produce a decent amount of milk too. They're very versatile. And we actually breed these to help students take them to the fair, the local county fair for 4-H and FFA projects. Okay, goats continued. Certain cultures really value goats. It's important as goat meat and milk, and we all know that the superior health effects of goat milk. There's some dairy goats. Those could be, I'm not actually even sure, not so up on my dairy goats, but those are Nubians. And then there's also, those are mohair. Can't think of the word, but you can actually produce fiber from them and make things out of mohair. Okay, goats continued. Okay. Quickly going to go through the rest of this. Other animal products, oysters. A lot of this now is done through aquaculture, where we grow it in a controlled environment again to produce these basically shellfish in this case. Hogs were US number 30. Basically, we're not a big hog producer. Just not a lot of pigs produced in California. Sheep and lambs, we ranked number 2 in the country, and we have quite a big percentage. And used to have a lovely culture locally where the goat herders would bring their sheep in the springtime over here to this area. I haven't seen them in the last couple of years. I hope they haven't gone out of business, but they'd basically follow the early spring rains and bring them here in the spring, and then it's the Basque people, actually from around Bakersfield, where the people brought them over here from Spain originally. And then they would take them up into the mountains during the summer, when they had feed up in the mountains. Okay, Basque origin, that's right here on this slide. There's some goats, sheep. Actually, I took that picture out in the Mojave. And then I also took the one on the right. Those are your bighorn sheep. Good populations of those, still further west of us here. That was actually taken at Afton Canyon right there. And only problem between these two together is that they sometimes transmit disease amongst the two of them. So we've got to watch out for that. Sheep and goats. Turkeys, not that important. We used to be very important. We were the turkey capital. Jess Ranch over here, where all the shops are now, was the biggest turkey ranch in the country at one point. And then last part of this is sustainable practices in animal production, controlled grazing, well-managed pastures, sustainable grazing basics, and actually this now points us back to the other PowerPoint, the one on sustainable grazing management in the Mojave. So I'm going to stop right here. Yep, absolutely. So thank you.